What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Based on fossil evidence, the rose has been around for over 35 million years. Whether it was the Greeks associating with Aphrodite, the Christians tying them to the Virgin Mary, the Hindu using them as a symbol of love between Vishnu and his wife Lakshmi, or the Victorians giving it the more modern link to modern romance that we know today, roses have been a ubiquitous symbol of love and beauty for as long as people have given gifts. If you're looking for a more unique gift for a special someone this year, but still want to stay within the theme of roses, this video will show you how to make leather roses that will outlast anything from the garden. Welcome to BHE Crafts, where my one true hobby is collecting hobbies. Today we're leather crafting some roses. So I've taken a few steps to make this project a bit more complicated, but at the surface this is pretty easy. Absolute bare essentials you'll need. You're going to need a piece of veg tan leather for the petals and the leaf. What I used is about 4-ounce leather. Probably wouldn't go heavier than that, though if you have thinner, it's probably not an issue. You can use veg tan for the stem, though I chose to cut strips out of some chrome tan that I happen to have laying around. Veg tan will be needed for the petals though, since it does involve wet forming, and you can't wet form chrome tan. You will need dye of whatever colors you want. I happen to choose red and black, but obviously a more traditional rose would use green for the leaf and stems. You'll need some kind of wire to use as the stem that you can wrap the leather around. I happen to use floral wire that you can pick up at Walmart or pretty much any craft store. You can go thicker for a stiffer stem. You'll just have to make sure you can get it through the holes of the rose petals, so either cut larger ones or be a bit more forceful. Some rubber bands will also be helpful for keeping the pieces together when they're drying after the wet forming. Obviously, you're going to want to consider how you want to display these roses. I decided to put them in a vase. I chose to make my own, which is also included in this video, but it's a vase. You obviously have a ton of options for that, especially since for these leather roses, it doesn't actually need to hold water. Lastly, you will need a few tools. I use a desktop laser cutter, a Glowforge Basic specifically, to cut the petals and leaves and do some additional engraving, but you could do this with an X-Acto knife, box cutter, really sharp knife of just about any kind, or even scissors, as long as they can cut through whatever leather you happen to choose. This isn't a particularly complex pattern, so you don't really need to be able to get into too tight of corners. Scissors would work. It's just going to take a little bit longer. You'll probably want gloves for when you are doing the dyeing, and probably some kind of snips for cutting whatever wire you end up using for the stem. Start things off, I purchased this pattern from Etsy, specifically from the seller Gotro, and the listing was called Leather Rose Pattern Floral Bag Accessory. Though there are several of them on Etsy that are pretty similar, I'm assuming the process is pretty much the same as well. The seller does have a video that goes with their listing, so I would recommend go ahead and check theirs out as well, just to see how we each did it. It's pretty similar. I'll put a link to that listing in the video description below. Pattern was $6 at the time I happened to make these, I believe. So if you don't have a laser cutter, you'll want to print out the pattern on paper, tape it to your leather, and carefully cut out each piece. For my roses, I pulled the PDF into the Glowforge UI and nested them, basically just positioned them as best I could for the pieces I had. Each piece only needs to be cut once per rose. I chose to make 6 roses, so I cut out 6 of every piece. The strip for the stem is included in the pattern, but I chose to leave that out and just make my own strip once I got to that point towards the end. Quick tip for cutting leather with a laser: if you aren't doing any engraving, cut the laser with the rough side up, since most of the charring tends to happen on the top surface. Makes it a little bit easier on the cleanup afterwards. So the person I made these for has an interest in Old Norse style runes, so I also bought a set of SVG files for a handful of bind runes, and I engraved the outermost petals with them. For that, I had to cut and engrave with the good side facing up so that I could do it all at once. Could have done the cut, flipped them and engraved them. Just the wonders of machinery. It's nice to do it all in one step. If you're going to do something similar, make sure you think about how the petals will look when they're formed. You'll want the top of the design to be along that outer circle, but you don't want to go all the way up to the edge because you will be curling the tips of the petals slightly. Also, these petals will overlap, so don't put any designs on there that are going to require being able to see all of every petal. So like if you're trying to do like a name, that may not work out. For each rose, you should have a stack of 4 different petal pieces, starting with 2, 3, 4, and then 5 petals respectively, plus one with 3 leaves and a single leaf. Now, you can dye or wet form these in just about whatever order you want. I chose to wet form them first. There's a ton of ways to wet form leather, and most people have their own personal preferences. I tend to be a bit more liberal with how much water I use. I fill a container with water and just fully submerge the pieces until the bubbles stop, as if I had just told Jack that there wasn't enough room on the floating door and promised to never forget him. Bet you didn't expect that rose reference in this video, did ya? Unlike the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, though, I prefer to use warm water. I doubt it has a major effect, but, it's more comfortable for me as the crafter. I also use a paper towel to wipe off the loose char before I started working with each piece. You can get a little bit more aggressive with it with sandpaper if you really want to, but I kind of just rub it off on a piece of paper towel. So I worked one at a time, basically just focusing on the bud portion of the rose and dealt with the leaf pieces afterwards. First, take a wire, fold over the tip. Mostly what I'm trying to do here is just make a good sturdy catch for that innermost set of petals so they can't just slip right off the wire. You could probably do this a few different ways, like tying a button to the end or looping the wire around the actual leather, but I found that this worked fine. It was pretty easy. As long as you're not pulling on it like crazy, it shouldn't pop through. So the basic idea for each set of petals is that you want to add a little curl to the top and then thread them onto the wire, wrap them around the previous set of petals. This isn't a particularly difficult task, but you do need to stay aware of which direction the curls at the ends of the petals are going to face, whether you have the rough side of the leather face in or out. I played around with a few different ways of organizing them, as far as rough side being always in, rough side always being out, alternating back and forth. I didn't really see a huge difference between them. I personally feel that I liked alternating them slightly. I felt like that helped each layer stand out a little more. In the end though, the only time I'd say that it really matters is for the outermost petals. You can do whatever you want, but I would recommend having the rough side facing in for those so that the smoother side is facing out. For my particular roses, since I had those engravings, obviously those had to face out. I used a rubber band with each layer to help hold the shape until it was time to put on the next one. If I was redoing this project, I would probably buy much smaller rubber bands, ideally small enough to just leave one on each layer. But with the size of the rubber bands I happen to have and having to wrap a bunch of times, basically every time I put a new set of petals, I would pop off the rubber band and move it to the new layer. The only exception is that I did leave the rubber bands on between the second to last set of petals and the last. So there were 2 sets of rubber bands per rose at the end of the wet forming phase. One rubber band was holding the outermost set of petals, and then there was one just inside that layer holding basically the rest of it together. Once all the bodies or buds of the roses are formed, it's time to move on to dyeing. Like I mentioned, you can absolutely dye these first and then wet form them, but since I chose to dip dye these, I felt like it was just easier to dye them afterwards. The advantage of dip dyeing at this stage is that it's very easy and provides a nice uniform color without worrying about brush marks. I actually dip dyed the bodies and the leaves. For my set of roses, I went with the black for the leaves and stems to give it a more macabre vibe. For both colors, I basically just filled plastic containers with enough dye to fully submerge the pieces I wanted into the dye. I find that red and black are pretty popular colors for the things that I make, so I have fairly good sized jugs of each. Be careful when you're pouring leather dye though. It's super thin and it's basically impossible to pour this without spilling. If you happen to find some secret to it, let me know. I always make a mess. The loose leaf pieces are pretty easy to just push under the surface of the dye. The rose bodies though did require a bit deeper of a container. I found that an empty pudding cup was actually perfect for this in terms of diameter and depth. I pulled the outermost rubber band off, flipped each rose upside down, and basically just dipped it into the dye till it's fully submerged, and then just kind of used that wire for the stem to hang it off of a bar and let it dry. Put some paper towels down underneath, obviously. Hang them upside down helps keep the right shape since they are now wet again, and you don't want them to spread out. If any dye is going to run, it will kind of give the strongest color at the edges of the petals, which I feel like would be a more realistic look, but not explicitly something I was trying to aim for. While it was drying though, let's hop over to the workshop real quick and make us a vase. So I did decide to make my own vase. I originally looked at 3D printing to see if there were some fun options for that. Didn't find any designs I wanted. Did consider trying out pottery. That's not something I'm currently experienced with enough to feel comfortable doing. So I decided to go with a wood vase using my wood lathe. Focus of this video is the roses, so I won't get too in the weeds for the vase, but basically at the core, I've had a 5-foot section of a crabapple tree sitting in my driveway for a year or two that I'm sure my neighbors love because it's just been sitting there. I got it from a guy that had chopped it down, and the intent was to make like pens and bowls out of, so vase is right up that alley. Went out into my driveway and cut off a piece that was a bit longer than what I expected to use. Did this in the middle of the night with a handsaw, so I hope my neighbors appreciate the fact that I ignored my perfectly good chainsaw because it was winter and there was snow on the ground, so it was cold. So my wood lathe isn't particularly powerful. It's about on par with what you would pick up at Harbor Freight, but it does get the job done. The first step was turning it from a generally round to a properly round piece, a roundier round, if you will. I didn't really go into this with a plan. This was my first time turning a vase, so it's kind of just cutting based on vibes. So I do mostly use carbide tip tools for when I'm doing my wood turning. I do own some more traditional bowl gouges, but I haven't really learned how to properly sharpen them, so they don't work nearly as well as a carbide tooling. I personally am a big fan slash supporter of carbide tooling for people that are kind of jack of all trades craftsmen like I am, because they have a much lower learning curve and it's much easier to just replace a carbide tip. It's a matter of seconds to toss out a circular or square carbide tip, put on a new one, and get back to cutting. If I come back to the hobby after 3, 5, 6, 12 months, I don't need to relearn how to particularly angle the tool. Carbide is generally pretty forgiving, though one of the kind of downsides to it, especially with wood cutting, wood turning, is that it's not really cutting, it's more tearing the wood. So carbide is kind of notorious for tear out, so that is something you'd have to watch out for if you were to do something similar. Some people do switch to like bowl gouges for the last, couple percent of the turning. Other people will just sand their way through it. You can also use like CA glue mixed in with wood shavings and kind of use that as like a filler. Personally, I went with the sanding route. Once I had a proper cylinder, I made the general shape that I wanted. Mostly the only thing that mattered to me was that the base be nice and hefty and wider than the top, since the roses were going to naturally be top heavy and hanging kind of out and away from the center axis. So I just really wanted to keep it from being able to tip. Beyond flaring the base enough to pass the back door plug test, the rest of the body was mostly just kind of a general let's add some curves exercise. No real plan, just running on vibes. I bored out the inside as best I could for the flowers to sit in. If I was planning on putting real flowers in this, I probably would have ordered some glass or metal inserts and then cut a cylinder or a tube that those could press fit or slip fit into. That way they'd be watertight and I could remove the insert if I wanted to wash them. Since these roses don't need to be watered and shouldn't be watered, the only thing that really mattered for me was just getting deep enough to avoid tipping. Then after that, I busted out the sandpaper and ran it up through the grits, starting around 80 and going up to about 600, I think. Mostly just whatever I happen to have laying around and just running it until it was smooth. For the outside, I opted for a spray-on shellac. I liked the color that it gave it, and it should also give some pretty good durability. For the inside, I went with a clear plasti dip. In theory, this probably does make it watertight. That was kind of the idea, but I wasn't too worried about getting that. It was more of just an experiment to see how it would actually get inside of the vase. I think it turned out well, but it doesn't really matter too much, especially since you can't see it anyways. With the vase completed, it's time to head back inside and finish up those roses. For actually putting the roses together, I started by taking the 3-leaf piece and pushing it onto the wire for the stem all the way up against the bottom of the bud. A quick bend of the wire will hold it in place while you get the rest of the pieces ready. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a strip on the pattern for the stem, but there's really nothing special about that piece, so I just cut a bunch of strips from the chrome tan leather that's black that I happen to have. I went with somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of an inch wide. The wider you go, the fewer twists you'll need to do to cover any given length of stem, but you're also going to get less flexibility, and if you do try to flex that stem too much, you're likely to kind of create a disjointed look. So I would recommend, if you're doing multiple roses, do one at a time, only cut one strip until you find a width that works for you based on the thickness of the leather, the amount of wraps you want to do, and basically just try something and, go either wider or narrower until you like the way it looks. I cut an angle at the top of the strip and then punched 2 holes that were pretty close together, and then basically just threaded the strip onto the wire going through both of those holes. To actually hold that against the bud, I pushed the tip of that strip up to the base of the bud and then folded the wire over to pretty much lock the strip up against it. This isn't a crazy secure connection, but I don't expect these to be handled a ton, so it should probably be fine. If I was going to make something that was going to be used a lot, say it was going to be a prop in a play or just something I knew a person was going to be handling a lot, I might go with glue, a single stitch, or maybe even a rivet to just lock it in place. But this worked for my purposes. From there, I basically just started wrapping the strip along the wire for the stem. The single leaf, I added 1 inch or 2 below the bud. You basically just thread that onto the wire, hold it in place where you want it, and then just keep on wrapping that strip and lock it into place, making sure that the stem of that leaf is underneath the stem that you're wrapping. It makes sense in the video. My goal was to make each rose a slightly different length. That way when they were in the vase, they would all sit at different levels. So I left the floral wire basically its full length and then just kept on wrapping the leather around it until I felt like I was at a good spot to stop. Then I added 2 small holes at approximately wherever I was, and the floral wire is actually thin enough that I was able to kind of weave it through both of those holes and then almost tie it off. Just bent it back over and basically fed it back through the other hole. That locked it in decent enough. Unless you're going absolutely ham on these roses, it's probably not going to come undone. The nice thing about that is then I was then able to grab that end, basically pinch that end, pinch the other end, and twist with the wrapping, which actually made it tighter. So just wrapping it by hand kind of left a little bit loose, but once I was able to grab those ends, kind of twist it like I'm trying to wring out a wet dishcloth, that really tightened it up. And then because it is the wire, it kind of held in place. Depending on what you're using for your wire, this may or may not work as well. I feel like it definitely would work for thicker wire. I feel like maybe if you somehow were using a thinner wire, it may not work as well, but I'm having a hard time imagining a thinner wire than floral wire. Once you do have the stem wrapped tight, snip off any of the extra leather and wire that you don't want, and voila, you've got a leather rose. Do the same for all the rest that you intend to do. I did this for 6, and then add them to the vase if you have one. And you've got yourself a handmade gift that fits the theme of Valentine's Day perfectly, with plenty of room for customization that will last for years to come. If you do want some extra shine, you could add something like leather sheen or resin to the petals. This will give it a acrylic protective layer, which does tend to be a shinier look to the leather in general. If you're feeling extra ambitious, you could even tool the petals and the leaves. This actually gives it a really good look if you have the patience and skill for it, especially for the leaves. I went with the engraving route, so I already had that extra detail, but if you don't want to do engraving, it is a really good way to give it just that texture that it really needs. I've seen other people do it, and it usually turns out really well. Thanks for watching the video. Now go out there and craft something cool.